What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 69, nice, of the Book Binge, where this week we're going to be talking about something a little bit different that's also going to be structured a wee bit differently. This week we're going to be talking about why you should read more classics. This is just going to be kind of a little bit of a discussion episode, so it's going to be structured a little bit differently, even though within a sort of similar format as I tend to normally do, but it is going to be a little bit different because of the topic. And so forgive me if part of this video is a little bit rough. Getting the notes done for this video wasn't working horribly well for me, but I wanted to do the video anyway. The thing that prompted me to try to at least do a video like this is generally just the fact that I am always sad when I come across people who are pretty much anti-classics, who are unwilling to read classics, or people who otherwise say things like, I've tried reading classics, or I hated the ones that I had to read in high school, or, situations like that. So I just wanted to explain a little bit of the reason why I tend to love the classics that I have read, and why I think that most people should try more of them in general, and why you should probably give them another shot if you're one of these people who has tried reading classics, or especially if you didn't like the classics you had to read in high school. Starting off with some of the good of classics in general, I think, is that a lot of classics, as long as you have an open mind or you're willing to learn from them, have a lot to learn or glean. Even relatively simple stories have a lot of material that can make you think a lot. A book that I've been reading recently at the time of recording is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And that's one that has a lot to say about people and about being nasty to each other and revenge, or not even necessarily revenge, but like petty revenge specifically, and just being nasty people to one another. It has a lot of commentary on topics such as that. A book such as The Picture of Dorian Gray has a lot to do with vanity and pride. A book like The Count of Monte Cristo, which I actually haven't finished yet at the time of recording, is pretty much the quintessential story of revenge specifically. There's a lot to say about social issues and control, about, in regards to stuff that you can find in a book like Brave New World. A lot of classics have a lot to get out of them if you're willing to look, or if you just have your mind open enough for those topics and those discussions, those ideas to penetrate your mind. A lot of them are really interesting to have discussions about. Of all of the books that I have had read-alongs for, or, posted thoughts for and had discussions with, most of my favorite ones to have these types of discussions with people for have been classics, because for whatever reason, the way that a lot of these books were written 100 or 200 or even 300 years ago was done in ways that invited a lot of discussion, because while many are stories, while many have plot, while many have characters, a lot of them are just as focused, if not more focused, on the themes of them than they are on those elements, which, depending on the story, can be a good or a bad thing, mind you. Another thing that I have found in my experience while reading classics is that a lot of them tend to be very human and realistic in unexpected ways. I think one of the things that classics get a bad rap for, at least in my experience, is that many of them, the way that certain bits of dialogue or character interactions are displayed seem unrealistic to how people actually behave in the real world. And to a certain degree, with some books, that is absolutely true. I would say plenty of the way that characters just inherently behave in Wuthering Heights isn't horribly common or realistic in that sense, but the underlying nature underneath the actions and the dialogue in Wuthering Heights is very real and very human, and speaks very critically to human nature to some degree, and that's where I get that enjoyment from. A book like Les Miserables doesn't have the best depictions of a couple of the characters. I know some people are rather character of Marius's character specifically, but even with that criticism, you can see the ideals that are trying to be portrayed through those characters, and I think that is just as enjoyable as super realistic character interactions that you might get in Sun Eater, because character interactions in Sun Eater feel realistic in the way that we understand realistic, interpersonal relationships today. The time that these books are written, these character interactions may have been accurate to how they actually were. But even if some of them are not today, it's the underlying material beneath it that makes them still feel real regardless. I don't know if that made any sense, but I tried my best to convey that. A lot of classics are also focused on things that we don't get much in books today. A couple of these things, one of these things I already mentioned just a bit ago was the thematic potency of stories. So a story like Wuthering Heights, again, I'm going to bring that up, but also a story like Frankenstein by Mary Shelley will have a story that may not be the most enticing to some readers, or characters that are just straight up unlikable in pretty much every single way, but the themes and the human nature underlying those characters and their reactions to the world and their actions and the dialogue and everything in their place of the story is what makes those stories good. Since I have been reading Wuthering Heights and have been using it as an example this entire video so far, I love the way that it depicts these characters in this horribly unlikable way. They're very unenjoyable characters to be with, in a sense that you wouldn't ever want to spend a day with pretty much any of them, except for maybe one or two, and even that would be pushing it to a degree. It's the fact that those characters are vessels for an ideal, or even just a thought that the author wants to put into your head. Even if the author isn't trying to tell you something's good or something's bad in their story, they're trying to make you think about what might be good or what might be bad. And that's kind of what I got about Les Mis. Les Mis is written by an author with ideals that I don't necessarily agree with in some ways, and he, makes very clear his ideals on certain topics in certain tangents of that book. But just being able to get a look into his mind is enjoyable. In other stories, it's just enjoyable to have those thoughts pierce your mind just out of nowhere and just be like, the author wants me to think about this. He never tells me what he thinks. They just want me to think about it. And that is always enjoyable to me. Another thing that some books will tend to be focused on is philosophy. So books like The Brothers Karamazov, which I haven't read yet, but I've heard a lot about. Books like the ones that Dostoevsky writes are ones that handle a lot with the philosophy, with the way that we fit in the world, the way that the characters fit in the world, what they think about the world. And even if the characters don't hold the views that the author thinks, it's their way of exploring philosophy. Philosophy is one of those subjects that's like, if you're reading it in a nonfiction sense, all of it will fly over your head, especially if you're reading the works of great philosophers and you're not super into philosophy. But the way that classics intermingle these philosophical ideas into a narrative is something that I always appreciate a lot. One of the stories that I liked a lot in this front was Charles Dickens's The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain. Or is it The Ghost's Bargain and the Haunted Man? I can't remember. It's one of the stories in his and other Christmas writings collection. Even A Christmas Carol to some degree falls in line with this. The thematic potency of the philosophical nature of those stories is something that I adored. It made them very memorable reads for that reason. And even beyond all of this relatively abstract stuff, a lot of classics also deal with human character and human nature, and a lot of these classics also deal with characters and plot and relationships in ways that generally your normal novel would, at least today. Like a story like The Count of Monte Cristo. Again, I haven't finished it, but the 200 pages of it that I have read so far, and loved, by the way, are about the characters and their relationships to one another and the story around those characters. The Count of Monte Cristo so far hasn't been so much about the themes, except the little bits of revenge that are starting to crop up, and vengeance and the desires for vengeance within a couple of the characters. But outside of that, the entire story has been focused on the story. And for some readers, that's what they want. There are still classics that can satisfy stuff like that. I would say a classic like War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy as well does a very good job of this. He goes every once in a while into one or two chapters of kind of the historical relevance of a particular section and how that relates to the ideals that he's trying to interweave into the story. But out of those 1,350 pages, I would say the second epilogue is kind of an exception to this because that's like a whole series of philosophical essays in some sense. But all four of the main volumes with epilogue 1 of War and Peace are like 1,200. They're probably like 1,250 to 1,300 pages all told. And I would say about 1,200 of those pages are just a story of characters, of events, stuff like this. So it's a really long story, but it is a story with characters and relationships that matter. The relationships are what make that book work for someone like me. That's many readers of the book's favorite part of the story is the character interactions. So if that's the thing you're looking for, there are still classics even for that. There is at least one classic guaranteed to be enjoyable to everybody. Heck, even a book like Dune by Frank Herbert, even though it's a science fiction book, is old enough at this point to be considered a classic by some people. Even that is going to work for people who are enjoyers of sci-fi and specifically space opera and maybe not necessarily much else. There are books to get you into an interest of reading more classics for sure, even if you're not somebody who's been interested in them much up to that point. And moving into a sort of the bad of classics is that admittedly there are some that can feel like a whole lot of nothing or feel like a whole lot of unenjoyable depending on what your taste is. Because classics encompass such a wide variety of different books and stories and novels that really just focus on such different topics and ideas and, even just different realms of storytelling. It's no different than the way that sci-fi can focus on idea-based sci-fi, so like really hard sci-fi, really soft sci-fi that's more about the story, and then sci-fi that's more about the characters interacting with certain hard sci-fi ideas. Like there's a whole broad spectrum of science fiction, for example, that some people are going to enjoy really hard sci-fi while some other people just don't enjoy really hard sci-fi. They want more of the fast and smoother action stuff. It's sort of a similar thing with classics. There's such a wide variety of books and topics and ideas and stories that are encompassed within classics that there are going to be plenty that you aren't going to jive with, and there are going to be plenty that you are sure to love at the same time. And sometimes it can be a bit hard to find out what those are, what your interests are that are going to work with you when trying to read more sci-fi. Sometimes you just kind of have to look around and ask people and research a little bit to find out what certain classics are about or what makes certain classics popular to determine if it might be something you're interested on based off of some of the other stuff you know. Like I've mentioned up to this point, Wuthering Heights has a lot to do with some of the slightly more abstract reasons that I personally enjoy classics, and that's not one that I think that everybody's going to love. I think that if I were to recommend Wuthering Heights to everybody, I would be shocked if there weren't just as many people who hated it as who loved it. Whereas a story like Count of Monte Cristo or even War and Peace, most everybody who I know who have read those books love them. There are a few people who inherently dislike them, and if they do, it's only because of one or two sections in them that are slower than the rest. Depending on what you are interested in and depending on what makes you click, some are going to work better for you than others, and sometimes you have to find out through what other stuff that you read, what other stuff you're interested in, what it is you might like about certain classics, and then pick up some of the ones that people recommend based on those tastes, and that's a great way to get into it. And then, of course, the last thing that I will say in this front in terms of the bad of classics is that, yes, some of them do admittedly have some dated language or even some dated ideology and ideals and certain tropes and whatnot that may not necessarily work today. For example, the little bit of Charles Dickens that I have read in A Christmas Carol and other Christmas writings, I have found to be the most difficult for me to read from an actual reading standpoint because his prose is easily the most dated, the most archaic of anything that I have read up to this point. So for me, that makes Charles Dickens a little bit harder than some other authors. Whereas this translation, specifically in the Penguin Classics edition of A Count of Monte Cristo, or The Count of Monte Cristo rather, is really, really easy to read and really easy to binge in a lot of ways. I thought that my edition, the 2013 translation of, I forget who exactly did the translation, but 2013 Penguin Classics translation of Les Mis was one that I just flew through because the reading experience was just so smooth. It was like a modernized version of the writing of the text without losing the spirit of the age of it. Like that really worked for me. There are some stories that are going to read easier than others, and for some stories, like Gravity's Rainbow on the shelf down there, are built that way. That book is really not easy to read, and that's by intent. So sometimes you just have to find the ones that are going to work for you, and as you grow more accustomed to certain writing styles and certain things that you're interested in, you you'll eventually determine what books you are willing to try out that might be a little bit more of a challenge. That's just kind of part of reading in general, not just classics. The main thing to know is that no one size fits all when it comes to classics. There are many of them that are love them or hate them. You just have to figure out which ones you love and which ones you hate, oftentimes by actually reading them, but also by, like I said, researching and figuring out which ones you might just because of what you're interested in. The ugly of reading classics is really just comes down to expectations. You really just kind of have to know more or less what you're getting into with a certain book. You don't have to get spoilers for any classic that you're interested in reading, but if you really want to know what it is you're getting into with certain stories, just ask a wide variety of people what they think about certain classics and relate that to your own reading journey and the things that you already like to determine if you would or not. My recommendation when it comes to reading classics is obviously that I think you should read more classics, as the title suggests, and as all of my gushing at the beginning of the video is like over a wide variety of classics. And just think of how many classics I've brought up in this video. Probably probably 3/4 dozen books or a dozen books or something that just I have read in my experience, or that I know plenty of other people who have read, and the way that those relate to things that are nice about it. The main thing is that classics and even literary fiction, which is a sort of quasi genre that most classics can fit into, isn't a genre. There are all shapes and sizes and types and tales of stories that can fit within classics. The main thing that determines a classic is that it's relatively old and has stood the test of time for one reason or another. Wuthering Heights and The Count of Monte Cristo are not the same genre, even though they are both classics. As I have said many times before, it is just a matter of finding what works for you. My recommendation is that you genuinely try really hard to find one that might work for you. Go to, if you're in Discord communities or on Reddit or different reading clubs or groups or whatever, and if you know anybody who has read multiple classics, try to have a conversation with them about things that you enjoy, things that you really don't enjoy, and try to find a classic that might work for you based off of those interests. And I think you're good to go, because even if you don't enjoy one classic, or if you really hate another classic, there might be even one further down the line that you absolutely adore. I've been relatively mixed on a couple classics like The Time Machine and overall a Brave New World. I think that Brave New World is an important story, but it's not one that I particularly enjoyed reading, while there are other classics like Les Mis and like Wuthering Heights that I just really, really like overall, or Frankenstein that I just adore. Not everything's going to work for you, just as not everything within certain genres are going to work for you. You may not like Brandon Sanderson, but love Steven Erikson, or vice versa. Just have to know your tastes and figure out what's going to work for you based off of those interests. Don't be afraid to try some out every once in a while, just for the heck of it. And with that all being said, that is the end of this video. Maybe I should consider doing another video in the future about classic recommendations for multiple tastes, since I have said stuff like that in the future. It would be pretty complicated to make, especially since I haven't read a whole lot of them myself up to this point. Maybe a dozen and a half or something like that, but would be a fun thing to do at some point in the future. Would be even more fun to do, multiple times as I experience them more myself, or if I just did them in discussions with other people who have read other books that I have not. Either way, thank you guys for watching this video. If you did, I obviously recommend that you at least try out a few more classics if you are somebody who has been a little bit more reluctant to do so. If you are somebody like me who has been reading a lot of them recently, I hope you have been having just as much fun as I have with the majority of them, as I have really enjoyed the majority of the ones that I have read. But with that being said, again, thank you guys for watching. I'll be back again on Tuesday with a review of Brave New World, in which you'll get all of my detailed thoughts on that book. But thank you guys for watching. I'll be back again in the next video.